Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Chiaki Yamamoto. I'm a Senior Evaluation Specialist at IDB's Office of Evaluation and Oversight. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's panel discussion, Beyond Counting Beneficiaries. The session is going to be conducted in English, but there will be a simultaneous translation to Spanish and Portuguese. We'll kickstart this session with three presentations, brief presentations, but the session is meant to be very interactive. So I would like to encourage you all to pose the questions, share your perspectives and experience using the chat box in the Zoom throughout the session. We'll be monitoring them and reflecting them during the Q&A after the presentation. So I am going to venture a guess that the majority of the participants today, if not all, have seen an indicator that says number of people reached. In other words, counting beneficiaries. Now, this is a solid and really good indicator that serves its purposes. However, at times, it is as important to look at the quality or the depth of the impact. And in other times, we are working on the project that is not exactly amenable to beneficiary counting, such as governance or the project that prevent negative events from happening. And yet other times, we have an idea what sort of information we want to collect, but we are not quite exactly sure how exactly to go about implementing the data collection part of it. So the purpose of today's discussion is to explore these questions together. And I am delighted to have an excellent panel with us today, three distinguished speakers, each of whom have depth of experience and knowledge to share, but I'm also super excited they are all here together. And then I have an honor to introduce the three of them, and I'll go by the order of the appearance. The first, we are very lucky to have Ken Shomis with us as Chief Analytic Officer of Global Innovation Fund. He is leading the implementation of this practical impact measurement approach at the fund, which he will speak with us today. And before joining the Global Innovation Fund, he has also had a long distinguished career at the World Bank Group. And among other things, he has led major evaluations as the senior advisor at IEG, Independent Evaluation Group, and also co-authored the World Bank's flagship publication, World Development Report, on the topic of digital dividends. Our second speaker is Kessia Bertelman, and she's someone who says she feels energized by trying to figure out difficult to measure impact. And I think she's at the right place as the Director of Learning and Impact at Luminate, which is a media group organization that supports, among other things, civic engagement, free press, data, and digital rights. So she's going to share with us how Luminate is approaching this difficult to measure impact and what has been the learning so far. And she has an extensive background in public health and gender, and prior to joining Luminate, she has done really innovative, interesting work on the impact on the gender, both at the Girl Effect and the Nike Foundations. And last but not least, I'm thrilled to have Sasha Dichter, who is a co-founder of 60 Decibels. And he's going to share with us sort of the glimpse of how one can use the mobile technology that is readily available today and gather the direct voice of the end beneficiaries, people who actually matter. And prior to co-founding 60 Decibels, he had held various leadership positions at Acumen, early on as a director of business development, and later on as a chief innovation officer. And as a chief innovation officer, he has led and development of this lean data approach, which 60 Decibel is taking on today, and the approach that he's going to share with us today. So without further ado, I am going to pass the floor to Ken to kickstart the first presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Chiaki. Hello to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me begin by sharing my screen. One moment. Thank you for your patience. So let me begin by telling you how our impact metric drives the way we at GIF select, appraise, and manage our investments. So first, some background about GIF. Again, I'm Ken Shomitz. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer there. We are an impact-first investor. We invest both in nonprofit and for-profit organizations using any financial instrument available. And we invest in early-stage innovations, things that we think have a chance of scaling up to benefit millions of people who are living on less than $5 a day. We consider ourselves to be something like a venture capitalist, not because we're out to make money on our own account, but because, like a social venture capitalist, we're willing to take risks. Innovations are inherently risky. We're willing to take substantial risks in search of high payoffs and social benefit. We think we can take these risks prudently because we rely on evidence. Basically, the more evidence you come to us with when you make a proposal, the more money we're willing to invest in your innovation. Because we figure that the stronger the evidence, the higher the likelihood that the innovation will actually have some impact. We invest across all sectors and outcomes. So you just a sampling here, we work in agriculture, in water, mobile money, women's empowerment, education. So we take really seriously the idea that we want to maximize the total social benefit of our portfolio. So we face two big challenges in devising an impact metric that would help us do that. First, we figured that we needed a universal metric so that we could compare across these very different kinds of outcomes. And so that we could aggregate our expected impact at the portfolio level. In addition, we wanted to distinguish between different levels of impact. As Chiaki mentioned, counting beneficiaries is a first step, but there's a big difference between whether the impact is you received a radio message or the impact is your life was saved. So we need to be able to adjust for that kind of difference in depth and impact. Our second challenge is that most of our investments, you can think of them as being like demonstrations or tests. We're basically in the de-risking business. Our investments, many of them have relatively small impacts now, but that's because we're testing them and we hope that they're going to grow up and have large impact over the long term. And indeed, truly impactful innovations might take 10 or 20 years to reach their full addressable market. So how do we balance these considerations? Well, here's our solution. We call it practical impact. Practical because we want it to be relatively easy to apply. And it starts with a prediction of what we think the breadth of impact is going to be. And by that, we mean the number of people who will benefit, the number of low-income people who will benefit 10 years from now if the innovation successfully scales. We then adjust that by the depth of impact. How much of a difference does it make to the typical beneficiary? And finally, we adjust again by the probability of success, the likelihood we think that it will actually grow up and have that impact. Now, that might seem a bit daunting, but we find that we're not looking for three significant digits of accuracy. We're just looking for an order of magnitude. And we find it relatively straightforward at first glance to look at an innovation and say, well, how many people are going to benefit? 100,000, 1 million, or 10 million? How big is that benefit per person? Just a little bit or a lot? And what's the chance of ultimate success? Is it a long shot that is very unlikely, or is it reasonably assured? So the key to doing this is our audacity in proposing a single universal measure of depth of impact. And you could think of this as the relative change in the typical beneficiary's standard of living. So in the units we use, if someone increases their consumption by 100% for 1 year, we call that 1 unit. If they increase their consumption by 10% for a year, that's 1/10 of a unit. And we have conversion factors that translate changes in health, education, mortality, and now even women's empowerment into the same scale. So we can differentiate between something that's a perceptible impact, 10-minute faster commute for everybody in a city, a significant or substantial impact, getting an extra year of good quality education, or a transformative or life-saving impact. So you ask, well, how can we do this? And the trick is a combination of measurement and being explicit about our values. We depend very much on measuring our impact in the appropriate units for the kind of impact we're looking at. So for instance, we build into our work measurement of changes in income, changes in health status, changes in educational achievement. And then we decided it's better to be explicit about our values. How much do we value each one of these different kinds of outcomes? Because in the end, if you choose investment A over investment B, you're expressing some values, and maybe implicitly and maybe inconsistently. We think it's better to be explicit about those values. And we're now moving on to actually incorporating women's empowerment and agency in our framework. So thanks very much. I'll be happy to expand on this later if there are any questions. Stopped.
Thank you, Ken. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Kesia.
Thanks very much, Chiaki. And I'm just going to share my screen here. And it's lovely to be with you all today to talk about how Luminate is attempting to apply learning principles in order to better understand our impact. As Chiaki mentioned, what we're tackling at Luminate is pretty significant. We are funding and supporting nonprofit and for-profits in the broad area of democracy and governance as we look at empowering just and fair societies. And we have 4 different interlocking areas of focus: civic empowerment, data and digital rights, financial transparency, and independent media as well. So as you can imagine, those areas are very diverse, they are very broad, and there's huge systems that are encapsulated in the sort of concepts that underlie our learning framework related to those impact areas. And so when we were thinking about how do we measure changes in democracy and governance, we wanted to rely on systems thinking and to draw on that in order to develop a framework for measuring our work. And so this really draws on the work of Karl Popper and then Dave Snowden in the Cynefin framework, if you're familiar with that, where there's concepts of clock challenges, and clock challenges are very discrete, controllable challenges. They tend to be things like, how do you send someone to the moon? It's a problem that can be solved with a number of, millions of step by step by step. It's not an unsolvable problem, but it's something that might take a while. In contrast to that, you have cloud challenges, and cloud challenges are complex. They are things that can shift related to context, related to dynamics. If you think about the types of problems that Luminate is trying to tackle, with thinking about shifting the civic space within a country, that's a cloud problem. And then in the middle there, between clock and cloud, there's sort of the murky middle where maybe it's not quite complicated, not quite complex, but some things that we need to learn about kind of lie in the middle of that. And we recognize that the world isn't binary. Not everything is complicated or complex. And so when we're thinking about these challenges that are the things that we're trying to tackle at Luminate, we kind of think of them on this continuum here. So for clock challenges on the left side of the screen here, the path is fairly direct. There's a lot of steps that might be involved, but it's something that can be accomplished with a step-by-step sort of orientation. And in the murky middle, the problem might be fairly well understood, but the solutions are not. And so you have a divergent path as you're trying to figure out what to do to tackle the problem. And for cloud challenges, there's very little clarity, there's very little consensus. You could talk to 5 different people, they would have 5 different solutions for that problem. So it's very emergent and nonlinear. So a lot of the things that Luminate is tackling, again, are in that murky middle and cloud category, if you will. And so what that means for our monitoring, evaluation, and learning is that it has to be iterative. It has to be based on learning that's as we go, grounded in evidence, grounded in experience, but it has to draw on the learnings that we gather along the way, because we don't always know what the solution is. If you're thinking, for instance, about how do you tackle the challenges of civic empowerment in a space where there's very little media freedom and data rights are suppressed, then that's a challenge that would very squarely fall within that complex category. Also at Luminate, we learn at multiple levels. So we have the 4 impact areas that I talked about. We also have many different geographies that we work in around the world in multiple regions, and we have different types of projects as well. So we had to also think about how do we sort of think about a learning culture that will enable us to respond to all of those different variables. And we needed something that could allow us to respond to new information because of changes in context as well. So as you can imagine, if an election happens in the geographies that we work in, that could completely change the nature of our work, the partners' work that we support, and when they have to change direction in order to tackle the new realities that they face. And lastly, but not least, we wanted to inspire a team culture that really supports and rewards learning. So that means that we had to do away with the idea of KPIs. KPIs work really well, and sort of metrics and KPIs work really well if you have something like a clock challenge. If you have something that's more toward the end of the spectrum of a cloud challenge, then something like a hypothesis works a lot better. So in a hypothesis statement, if we do something, then we believe this outcome will happen, serves us much better than having very fixed KPIs that would change quite quickly based on contextual changes. So what that means, I'll just give you a broad overview of the learning framework that we developed in response to this. So our learning framework does not have KPIs, it has hypotheses. There's a couple of examples of the hypotheses here. One is related to our independent media work, and one is related to our financial transparency work. So each of our 4 core impact areas have hypotheses that are the length basically of the strategic period, and we're testing those hypotheses over time with the different types of grants that we make to our partners. Alongside, though, we really needed to be careful to identify our own assumptions and be careful to really make sure that we're not falling prey to our own biases, that we're making the implicit explicit and identifying assumptions related to cause and effect, context, and implementation, surfacing those assumptions so that we can better understand what we believe will happen in the contexts and related to the hypotheses that we're testing. Step 3 is about collecting the evidence, and this falls into 2 categories: the confirming evidence, what we think would happen is actually happening, and disconfirming evidence as well. So confirming an evidence and disconfirming evidence related to our hypotheses and our assumptions. The disconfirming evidence is a really crucial piece. So we're not just collecting evidence about things that are working well. We are putting into place practices that help us look at disconfirming evidence and surface that disconfirming evidence to show our flaws in our thinking, helping us guard against confirmation bias and making sure that we are trying to contest our own thinking and not just legitimize it. And there's a number of sources of evidence there on the screen before you as well. What we've learned so far in relation to all of this is that shifting to a new way of thinking takes time. Most of the people in our organization are used to more of a standard sort of M&E practice, and shifting to something where we're leaning quite heavily on hypotheses rather than KPIs is a culture shift and a mind shift, and that doesn't happen overnight. Unpacking our assumptions has been really valuable. It's really engendered some really rich conversations about what we believe sits behind the decisions that we make related to our work. And taking time to reflect has been challenging during the pandemic. And I want to say transparently that we haven't gotten as far in the evidence collection as I had hoped by this time, because the partners that we support were under such pressures in their own context related to COVID that we wanted to give them a bit of breathing space related to the evidence collection. And so we haven't done as much of that as I would like, but that means that it gave us opportunities to have reflections on our own at Luminate as we think about the hypotheses and the little bits of evidence that we can see so far. We still have lots of questions. It's early days yet. We have questions about how we can better encourage our grantees, our partners, to consider this way of doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We don't want to impose the system, but we want to give this opportunity to them if they should desire that. And when we're trying to shift systems, how often should we reconsider our evidence? We have lots of questions about if we look at our evidence too quickly, would we perhaps think that our hypotheses, for instance, were trending in a direction that might be in a different direction than what is actually happening if we're looking at evidence too quickly and not giving ourselves enough space to sort of sit with evidence over time as we're thinking about shifting systems. So I will pause there and hand it back to Chiaki. Thank you.
Thank you, Kesia. So we'll switch the gear toward exactly, so how do you go about collecting the evidence? And I'll pass the floor to Sasha.
Great, thank you very much, Chiaki. It's a pleasure to be here. I will also share my screen and hopefully do it quickly. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'll give a little bit of an introduction to what we're doing at 60 decibels. And we have just a short little video, which will do it more efficiently than I otherwise would. So I'm just going to play that. I hope that's all right. Where did my PowerPoint go? Okay, so hopefully that helped. As you can see, 60 decibels it's the volume of human conversation, and really everything we're doing is focused on the concept of listening. And our observation has been, in the context of this panel and what Chiaki teed up for us, is that we saw the common practice for impact investors to fundamentally count outputs and then have some sort of conjecture about what those outputs translated into in terms of outcomes. And we felt for many years that a lot of the reason was because it was just simply too hard to get outcomes data. And so we wanted to solve that problem by making it easy to get directly to end customers and beneficiaries. And that is what we have been doing. A typical, if you look at a typical impact investor report on their work, you'll see things like number of farmers reached, number of students attending new schools, number of female clients served, and the like. But I think we all know that this is not what we fundamentally care about. We care about whether farmers are better off. We care about whether female clients have more say in their homes, and we want to know not whether or not lending happened to microfinance clients. We actually want to know if they're earning more. So fundamentally, what we've done is built an infrastructure that makes it easy to do this. As you saw in the video, we have a network of researchers in more than 50 countries. And what our team does is actually work with our clients to help them turn their overall hypothesis around social impact into a set of metrics, and turn those metrics into questions, and turn those questions into comparable data. The comparability point is really important to us. We really feel like it's a good start to get data, but a more important thing is to be able to get data that people can compare like to like. So similar interventions that will have different results for their clients. And to us, that really feels like the holy grail in terms of where we're trying to go as a sector. We take as a given that different businesses with the same business model will have different financial performance, different operational performance. But most of the approaches that we use when we're trying to get to outcomes assume that two companies with the same business model will have the same outcome per kind of unit of person reached. And we really feel like if we're ever going to learn to improve the social outcomes that we create through these interventions, we really need much more granular, much more specific data. So our hope is that the data we're gathering is actionable by the operating companies, actionable by the funds, and that it uncovers opportunities to improve impact. I really like the framework that Kesha just shared in terms of, cloud problems, murky and cloud, I think it was. I would say that obviously the cloud problems are the hardest, and our approach, can give helpful data there, but it's certainly not definitive data there, given the overall approach. But I would say for both cloud problems and kind of murky problems, and cloud problems to a certain extent, what we need is data to guide us along the way. So rather than simple KPIs that tell us yes or no's, what we're really trying to do is to help support cultures that think about learning, that think about data, allowing for adjustment and improvement. And in that way, when we see our clients acting on the data and discovering gaps between potential impact and actual impact, we're really, really excited. So just to finish up, I'll just show you just a couple slides with actual data. And so all of what I'm going to show you in the next two slides is based upon what we heard directly from end customers. So in this example, this is the aggregate results for a portfolio in which a financial inclusion portfolio in which every circle is a company. The size of the circle is its reach. The y-axis is relative inclusivity. So are the customers of this company more or less poor than the population? Higher up, they're serving poorer customers. Lower down, they're serving less poor customers. And then the x-axis is a metric based on 5 areas of financial inclusion impact: ability to save, money earned, etc. Again, all based on what we heard. In total, this chart represents hearing from more than 10,000, about 3,000 or 4,000 customers. And so what you can see is the ability to actually compare, as Ken was talking about, different companies with similar business models and see how are they doing on inclusivity, how are they doing on financial inclusion, impact as a whole, outcomes. And one of the things that we see, which is interesting and perhaps concerning, is that the top right corner of this chart remains empty. And what that means is to have a high degree of financial inclusion impact and be highly inclusive is certainly continuing to be challenging within this particular portfolio. And you can also see that some of the larger companies are less inclusive than some of the smaller companies. You can start to see these trends and then start to make informed decisions about where you want to allocate capital and, again, what relative performance looks like. One other chart, and again, I won't go into this into detail and try to describe it, but this is based on work that we've done in off-grid energy, speaking to more than 50,000 customers. I think this is in more than 30 countries. And you can see various things. Each of these different colors is a different sector. So you can see, again, relative inclusivity of the various sectors: solar lantern, solar home systems, mini grids in the kind of area chart on the left, and materiality of impact, et cetera. And really the point here is just to share that I think sometimes there's a feeling that if you're going down to the end customer level, it's going to be a challenge to synthesize that data and get comparisons. And we've really tried to, dispel that myth and really make it easy to get super granular data, but also comparative data that will teach us about themes, about sectors, and obviously about what that means for the end customers being served. So I will stop there and return the floor to everyone so we can do Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. I see some questions coming in, and I encourage the participants to continue posing the question on the chat box. The first question relates to sort of the data collection. So there's a question to you, Ken, at GIF. Do you actually go back and collect the data, actual results, after you make the projection 10 years down the road? And then a similar question to Kesia, how do you gather the evidence, and who collects the evidence from whom and how? If you can maybe share that experience with us. And Sasha, please feel free to join in and jump in if you see any points that you want to add.
So if I may start, yes, intrinsic to our model is this idea that we're going to keep monitoring our investees and gathering more information about how they progress. In fact, I was very much struck by Kesh's presentation. We're very much in the hypothesis testing world. The scaling up of innovations is kind of a continual testing. Will this intervention actually increase children's education? Will people, if you let them do pay-as-you-go purchase of LPG, will more poor people be able to afford it? So we have not exactly KPIs, but hurdles as to, if this hypothesis is correct, then we think that in 2 or 3 years, we'll see this result. And so we try to build in that evidence generation process, indeed using the kind of great work that Sasha talked about, at least in spirit, and then iterate with new hypotheses.
And then on the data collection, there's a couple different ways that we think about it. One is sort of what we gather internally versus what we can gather externally. So in the internal category, I would think of things like the reports that we get from our grantees, from our partners, where they actively consider their own learning questions that they developed in consultation with our funding leads and the evidence related to those. And then we have other internal mechanisms, such as our own internal reflection sessions, where our programs team think about what they're observing, about what's happening related to the activities of the portfolio and how that relates to the hypotheses that we have. But we also want to counterbalance that with external evidence as well. So really actively looking at what's happening in the sector, what is the new academic learning pointing to that either supports or contests our hypotheses as well. And also thinking about how can we continually test our own thinking in ways that might be a little bit less on the sort of acceptable side, if you think about sort of data that's usually accepted in academic circles. But because our work moves so quickly, we have to consider data that's not traditional. So social media data, for instance, and data from sort of informal channels that we need to consider, as well as the more formal surveys and the more formal research that we have as well. So we're open to all kinds of data, and especially data that helps us contest our own thinking and helps us challenge our hypotheses.
Thank you. Sasha, there's actually a question about how do you actually go about collecting the data? Can you elaborate a little bit on the actual steps that you take?
Absolutely. So we primarily use phone surveys, although obviously we also use SMS and all these other tools. But we have a trained network of about 750 people in 50 countries who speak 125 languages, and they are phoning the end customers and end beneficiaries on their mobile phones in local language. And so we have really found that this, a typical survey will last about 15 minutes. It's a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. And what we have found is that mix allows us to get this really high quality comparable data and also ask open-ended questions. So we're making sure that we are not overly defining what the metrics are going to be. And we can hear directly from customers, not just the what of the impact they've experienced, but a bit of the why behind that as well.
Thank you. And in the example that you shared of I think, financial inclusion, about 2,000-3,000 customers' voice collected, how long does that sort of engagement last? I mean, what's the time span that you look at?
So for a given engagement with one company, it'll be 8 to 12 weeks. And since we have this infrastructure all over the world, we can do that simultaneously. So in that particular case, and I think I did the math a little quickly, but it was about 20 companies, give or take. It took us about 3 months end to end. So basically over the course of, I think it was over the course of the summer. And it's usually about 250 respondents per company, give or take.
Great, thank you. And Kesia, there is a sort of follow-up question related to the evidence collection. So it says, you talked about collecting evidence, positive and negative, for learning. Does that include direct evidence from the ultimate beneficiaries of grants? What do you think of grievance redress mechanism as a tool for measuring and understanding impact?
Great question. So we are just starting to consider some research and some surveys that would be conducted with direct beneficiaries. In our case, the direct beneficiary is a little bit, sometimes it's easy to find them. Sometimes it's a little harder because a lot of our initiatives are sort of at a countrywide level. So our grantees, for instance, might be implementing programs that actually indirectly affect the democratic civil engagement, for instance, for an entire country. And so, so we are actively looking at ways where we can gather more direct feedback from people who are affected by the programs that we fund. And then related to the grievance redress mechanisms, I think this is a really intriguing and exciting tool. We haven't specifically looked at that at Luminate, but we are fully committed to transparency and to being very candid about our funding, and also really want to hear as much as we can from beneficiaries. So I imagine that will be something that we continue to explore. I should also mention that Luminate is quite a new organization. We're only 2 years old, and so we are starting to put into place some of these, some of this broader thinking as time goes on too.
Thank you. And following up on that, a little bit of shifting the question to the attribution and the counterfactuals. Given I mean, granted, there is a caveat that there is still a newness in the approach that you are taking, both at GIF and Luminate. The question is, do you also collect, or do you also plan to collect data for counterfactuals? Can we use these techniques to better assess attribution of results to the interventions and investments? It's open to all of you.
So let me jump in. We always strive to measure or predict our impact against the counterfactual. We're very eclectic, and our investees are very eclectic in their capacity for doing that. But I would say that, I don't know, about a third of our investments actually have a rigorous measurement of a counterfactual built in one way or another. So it's an important question, and we're open to different ways of doing it. Sometimes through an RCT, sometimes by gathering comparable information from outside.
Yeah, I would say for us, it looks a little bit different. A few of our partners, our grantees, are collecting counterfactual data as part of their own M&E systems and data gathering. More broadly at the organization level, at the funder level, we're relying more on the disconfirming evidence. It's in the similar spirit of a counterfactual, but relying on collecting the disconfirming evidence that disproves our hypotheses, along with the confirming evidence that tests the hypotheses as well. So looking at those two pieces side by side.
And there's also sort of the question of the timing. So I guess to Ken, how do you go about projecting out 10 years down the road impact? And do you adjust your assessment along these 10 years period? And to Kesia, the question is, I guess, also the timing of when you adjust the hypothesis, because you alluded a little bit, but do you have a thinking already? What's the time frame you might want to set the time frame to keep tracking the same thing for a while? Do you have a view on that? And then to Sasha, usually among different companies and organizations you work with, how long after the project initiation or completion do you usually go in to collect these beneficiaries' voice?
Should we take it in that order? I'll start off.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think intrinsic to the audacity of projecting 10 years out is the idea that we'll continually come back and make corrections. So we build impact measurement into our work wherever possible so that we get an updated view of what the impact per person is, what's the depth. We track success in the rate of growth of the innovation, so that helps us adjust the trajectory of where we think it's headed for 10 years. And we base our probability of success on certain risks. As those risks are surmounted or not, then we can readjust the probability of success. And we can rely on benchmarks, things like the proportion of companies that raise a seed round that go on to Series A, or the proportion of projects at the IDB or World Bank that are rated satisfactory. The 10-year projection, it sounds a little audacious, but if you think about what financial investors do, what a venture capitalist does, and venture capitalists might project, well, we hope to sell this company in 5 years, so let's derive the value of the company 5 years from now. But that depends on the discounted cash flow in years 5 to 10. So we're all making predictions based on available evidence and then refining them over time.
It's a great question about how evergreen are your hypotheses. And it's something that we are actually actively shifting our thinking on right now. Originally, we thought that our hypotheses would last for the length of a 4-year strategy period. We have started to have discussions internally about that may and may not work in some cases. So there might be instances where if something radically shifts in a given context or related to one of our impact areas, let's say financial transparency, let's say there's international policies and laws that come into place in multiple geographies that suddenly make a hypothesis sort of a done deal or something that needed to be reconsidered, then there's no point in keeping that hypothesis just for the sake of having a static hypothesis. It's all about learning, right? So if we feel, we're coming to the conclusion that if we feel that we have a solid enough idea about the trajectory and outcome of a hypothesis, we would feel comfortable changing that hypothesis before that 4-year period.
Sorry, the question I think I have is about timing.
Yes.
Okay. There was another question, which I'll do very quickly, which was GDPR and how do we handle that? And the short answer to that is we are relying upon, we use the phone numbers of the companies themselves, and they have permission to contact their customers. So they give us the permission to contact their customers on their behalf. Timing, I think the spirit of the question, is it too late or something like that? I mean, again, what we found, I mean, Ken rightly points out, these investments are very long in duration. And so in most cases, we will have folks bring us in relatively early in the life of the investment and actually continuing to gather that all that ongoing data that Ken is talking about. Our belief is that we need to find a way to make that be a standard practice. So for an example, we've been working with BRAC International for the past 3 or 4 years. They have social performance targets across all of their geographies, which is 6 countries. And we are annually gathering data in a standardized survey from their end customers to actually give them the information they need regarding whether or not they're hitting those social performance targets. So it is an annual process that allows for adjustment. It is used as a management tool. And we really see that as best in class behavior. And there was another quick question. It's all connected, so I hope it's okay. Around resources, how do you convince people? I mean, I think we could spend an hour or 2 talking about that. My cheekier answer to that question is, how do we manage to convince ourselves that we cannot do this? Meaning, how do we make 10-year investments based on the hypothesis that never listening in a systematic way to end customers is good enough? Because we're putting, not only, let's say, a few $1 million of capital at play, but our time, our resources, all these sorts of things, ultimately in service of a certain outcome. And as long as we can make getting that data affordable, I would argue that how can you afford not to is really how I would think about it. It's a very big shift in practice. And I think the reason we are where we are today is because it truly has been cumbersome. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, multiple years. We've brought, I think, unfortunately, in our intention to strive for accuracy and really high quality data, we brought a standard of practice from academia, which is really not fit for commercial contexts. And so someone who lives in a commercial context has appropriately reacted and said, this doesn't work for me because I'm running a company. And so in many ways, I think part of the shift needs to feel like something that you do in the context of a commercial enterprise, in terms of its speed, in terms of its cost, and in terms of how actionable the results are. And I think that will shift the mindset, which is, again, when we created what we were doing at Acumen, we just said we were the lean data team. We didn't say we were a social impact measurement team. And we would just say, do you feel like you understand your customers well enough? And any good CEO will say, no, I don't. How can I do that more? So to me, it's a little bit of a mindset shift, and we have to get out of this bucket that we've been in for a long time of, this is an evaluation. I don't know any leader of a company to whom you could say, I want to do an evaluation, and that person would be really, really excited. So I think it's a number of shifts that we need to do. And then our job collectively, 60 Decibels and other players, is to actually make it useful, affordable, quick, like all those words that we want it to be. Like, we have to actually deliver on that promise as well. And I think we're getting there. I don't think we're all the way there yet, but I do think we're making a lot of progress.
Thank you. It's interesting, Sasha, that you said it's more practical and maybe more cost-effective than the in-depth evaluation. But there are a couple of questions related exactly to the cost and resources. So one question is, it sounds like 3 approaches presented here would require more resources than a basic recipient counting on other more basic evaluation approaches. How did you convince your stakeholders and clients that it's necessary to set aside the resources required to implement these presumably more expensive approaches? And there's a similar question that's particularly relevant for smaller foundations and smaller organizations. Do you have any advice and tips for the smaller scale organizations to implement similar approaches?
Maybe I can start on this one. So we haven't found that the cost increases when we're thinking about taking the type of approach that Luminate is taking. Again, it's early days. We're a new funder and just starting out. But so far, I think that this approach actually helps us narrow the scope of our data gathering, because if you're thinking about testing hypotheses, there's sort of this natural process that happens in thinking about what data do we really need to test the hypothesis. It's not just about KPIs over here. It's about what do we need in order to know if the hypothesis is working or if it's not working. and that helps streamline the efforts. And so when you have that kind of orientation and that thinking, you might find that you only need one evaluation around one sub-question that's sort of nested within that hypothesis, rather than 5 evaluations, for instance, related to various KPIs. So, you know, stay tuned. We'll see if that cost-effective approach does work over time. But I'm hopeful that it can help us make us smarter about the data collection that we actually need.
So I'll jump in. I think the answer is that it varies a lot with the size of the investment, the inclination of the investee, the nature of the hypothesis being tested. And in some cases, we felt it necessary to do a fairly expensive RCT to demonstrate something that you might not otherwise be able to demonstrate. In other cases, we find it's fine to use more or less proxy data based on outputs or outcomes, and then use information from the literature to impute what the impact is. But I'll say that one thing that we're very excited about is creating more enterprises like 60 decibels, finding innovations that really make it faster, easier, cheaper for both public and private organizations to gather real-time data. So just as one example, we supported some researchers at Stanford who were working on ways to use remote sensing to measure yield of smallholder farmers on plots as low as a quarter of a hectare. So you could there are many applications for this, so that instead of testing out an agricultural policy with a test that might take 2 years and $500,000, you can do it in 3 months for $3,000. That's the promise. We're not quite there yet, but it's within sight. Another thing we're working with is working with organizations to better use their administrative data. There are lots of organizations that have rich administrative data that they could be using for the kind of real-time feedback that we've been talking about, but they haven't quite figured out how to tap that resource. Building a culture where you value the data, so you clean it a little better and then see how it becomes more useful, and therefore you clean it a bit more, we hope can create a virtuous circle. And we're working with health insurers in India to follow up that kind of approach.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question, do you consider that there is sort of a minimum size? For example, if there is a small funder that is, say, providing a fund to train 20, 30 people, does it make to take this approach, or do you have alternative suggestions for these type of smaller funders?
I mean, what I would suggest there is 2 things. One is I put in the chat actually some resources that are free and available that might be helpful. Listen for Good in the United States has done a nice job of coming up with 5 questions that they recommend every nonprofit ask. You know, I would start really, really small. You know, the Net Promoter Score, you know, we have a core insight set of questions, some of which are publicly available. You know, Net Promoter Score, did you experience any challenges with the service? You know, strongly agree to strongly disagree. This has improved my quality of life. Like very, very simple, but well-worded questions. And I would honestly, even if you have 20 to 30, just start to train your staff that's part of what you do. Every so often as you talk to customers and you just get answers to those questions. It's not going to be a giant example. It's not going to be all those sorts of things, but it's just going to orient the organization towards listening and orient that listening can turn into structured data that over time starts to become useful. So I would absolutely just start wherever you are. You don't need an outside firm to do it. And if I could go just back half a step in terms of resources, you know, one of the things we're doing right now in financial inclusion, you know, and it's an aggressive move on our part to subsidize to make things really, really affordable, is we are doing a major initiative around a financial inclusion index, which we are subsidizing. So it'll be $10,000 per company. And that will give comparative results for any financial inclusion company to up to 100 other companies around beneficiary level outcomes. You know, we think that is a price point that starts to get within the reach of, you know, not a 20 to 30 customer enterprise, obviously, but enterprise of any sort of size. And, you know, if it's, you know, our larger projects will cost maybe $15,000 to $20,000, but I just thought I'd sort of throw out some of those numbers because when one thinks about beneficiary level data, I think one thinks of hundreds of thousands of dollars as a starting point per enterprise. And again, the last thing I would say is to reconsider this as a cost only. We have seen, for example, we did some work with Omidyar in India, and when we revisited companies that we had worked with 3 years later, we saw, based on, they said, the data that we had gotten that they had then acted on, increases of net promoter scores on the order of 30 points, which according to the data will translate into about a 6% increase in revenues, perhaps more. So again, the idea that this is simply a cost, I think, is also outdated. I think if you start listening to your customers, respond to their concerns, you will generate value for your company in addition to generating value for those beneficiaries. And it really can be a win-win in a very powerful way. So I would think of it as an investment and not a cost center.
I just add quickly to that, Chiaki.
Please.
There's definitely costs associated with data gathering, but I also want to just reiterate the importance of an active learning culture. I mean, there's just so much wisdom and so much good stuff that exists within organizations, and just having a deliberate practice where you have reflection sessions, thinking about hypotheses or what's emerging from the data is very inexpensive. That's an internal just sort of time cost. Which is not insignificant, but think about those things as well as the costs of data gathering as well.
Thank you. I'm conscious about the time, but I have maybe squeezed one more question, which is about, similar to the attribution question, another question is about, is there a methodology of measuring impact of certain action innovation, i.e. eliminating possible impact of other factors? And I'll maybe add one more related to that, which is, when you're hypothesis testing, there are certain things that is context specific, that you see the results as context specific. How do you tease out the universal learning that is different from the context specific learning?
I'm happy to tackle the second.
I was going to say, go for it.
This is one of the toughest questions. When we're testing an innovation, we're trying to figure out, okay, does it work in this context at a small scale? But can it be scaled up and replicated in a different province in a different country? So fancy things like RCTs can help you answer that, and there are ways to get beyond just does it work or not, but the kind of qualitative evidence that Sasha's talking about from the customers, together with other kinds of qualitative work, give you insight into what are the moving parts here, what are the things that matter, and that you can use that to take your hypothesis to the next stage.
And very quickly, I would just say that that's something we're very interested in as well. We're also very conscious of the fact that in a different context where we work, we might have an overriding hypothesis, but we might not see the same type of impact. We might see transformative impact, sort of upward toward looking impact in some contexts. We might see just stabilizing impact or palliative impact in other places, just preventing things from getting worse. And so that's a pretty interesting challenge for us to tackle. And again, stay tuned. We're hoping to draw some rich learnings across that over the next few years.
And I think we need to be careful about the sort of quest for universality from one particular thing. I don't know. I spent obviously a long time at Acumen, and would sort of look at one thing in one place and sort of say, this is going to go everywhere. Like, context matters so much. And so I think as we get larger data sets, we start to see themes, we start to see trends, and those, we'll see those hold. But the idea that we're ever going to get out of the business of a culture of learning, a culture of inquiry informed by data from that context, I think that's just not how we're, this is a process of improvement and a process where we have to start with kind of a humility to recognize what we don't know. So I think that at best, what we'll have is informed hypotheses, and then we're going to test the next time, we're going to test the next time. And I think that's what progress looks like.
Thank you. With this, I think we have come to the conclusion. We have to close the session, and I apologize, I could not get to all the questions that was posed by the participants, because this was such a rich discussion and a presentation. But please follow the work of GIF, Luminate, and 60 decibels. And I hope we have another means to continue with this conversation. So thank you very much for all your valuable contributions. And thank you also for the brilliant panel.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.